We're scientists and our job is to do science. Why should we even care about public science literacy? And it turns out the answer to this question is actually a really important one. So last time we talked about the reasons science should be plugged into society. We introduced the idea of sociology of science as a way to discuss an aspect of science we rarely talk about in our courses, science as a social activity, because of course science is done by people. We look to examples in the real world to see where a lack of understanding the society-science connection created poor outcomes both in and outside of science, and we talked about ways to improve the science society connection through SciComm. So we basically already talked about this. So remember last week I showed you this diagram that I drew. It says science doesn't happen in a vacuum. On one side we have science, on the other side we have society. Science information goes to society and theoretically improves it. Not always though, and society feeds back onto science because obviously science is done by people, it's done in society, it's done with a social context. So society shapes scientists, influencing their expectations, values, beliefs, and goals. Public input into biomedical science research, for example, from patient groups can improve science research, it can improve health. There's also citizen science, or there's a new thing, I think it's also called civic science, which is a huge thing that is taking shape where anyone can become a scientist, basically. Then there's also the societal expectations of who looks like a scientist and sort of that idea of the absent-minded old guy with crazy hair that is a scientist that's always male, always white. So that makes it very hard for people that don't fit that to, first of all, think of themselves as scientists, and secondly, to succeed in science because they're basically going against the social currents. So all of this to say, historical context and social norms shape research questions in the context of society. All right, so I feel like, so now we have several reasons that, so the question I asked today was, we're scientists and our job is to do science. Why should we care about public science literacy? And actually, I came up with a bunch of reasons. And the first reason is that everyone actually likes scientists and think that they're cool. So I found the study from the Pew Research Center in 2015 that said science holds an esteemed place among citizens and professionals. Americans recognize the accomplishments of scientists in key fields, and despite considerable dispute about the role of government in other realms, there is broad public support for government investment in scientific research. And I think this is just for the US, but I think if you ask other countries as well, they maybe even value science to a much higher degree. So Pew asked people if science has made their life easier, and 79% of adults said yes. Granted, this was back in 2015 and before the COVID pandemic, so I'm not sure what that looks like today. But in general, even in the COVID pandemic, people liked scientists. Scientists are cool people, everyday people, quote, everyday people, non-scientists like scientists. So that's one reason they should be talking to society. The second reason is that being one part of science is being able to communicate with people. Scientists are also everyday people, though we always talk about scientists versus non-scientists. As scientists, we sometimes think of ourselves as separate from mainstream society, but we can go beyond the idea of the ivory tower and consider a different scientific ecosystem in which science and society are in conversation. We all have things in common with our fellow person, regardless of who they are, whether it's little things like we all use smartphones or bigger things like we all value staying healthy. And it turns out that communication is something that we kind of take for granted as scientists, and people are like, hey, write this paper, do this presentation, but we never get any real training on how to do that or ways to do that that's effective. And as a result, we end up feeling siloed from society because we don't ever learn those essential communication skills. And if we do, we learn them on our own time. The third reason is that scientists, if they're not in conversation, so one of the biggest things I learned in communications is if you don't write your message, someone else is going to write it for you. And obviously someone else isn't going to write it the way you want to write it. So that's kind of what's happening in the field of science journalism. The way journalists report science, the way most people even think about science is flawed. So Audrey Goldfarb, who is a graduate student, she wrote a really great blog for the Fancy Comma blog about, it's called Science Reporting Needs Less Hype, More Analysis. And these are just direct quotes from her article because honestly, I didn't have time to paraphrase them, but I'm just putting them here and attributing her as the author of these quotes. So, science is a process of discovery in which results and hypotheses change. Scientists' understanding of what the natural world, their model of the truth, changes along with those things. Despite this, media outlets often write about emerging research studies in terms that lead non-experts to interpret each study that comes out as fact. So, science is a process, and any scientist knows this. Once you get your results, the way you did your study, especially if it's like human subjects, who you used in your study. We talked about last week, 95% of clinical trials before the pandemic were white and male, just because people assumed that was the default. So um, we're now, as the US is now doing this whole huge focus on women's health research, and the president has just done an executive order to authorize health research that actually studies females. So, but it's like when you get those results from those studies, the journalists are like, oh, they did the study, scientists did the study, here's the result. This is the be all end all truth. And that's really not how science works. It's kind of a process. The facts that are being discovered are shaped by a number of factors, and they're never that conclusive. It's very hard to do a very conclusive study like that. And truth is very complicated and multifaceted, but journalists, especially those who don't have a science background, don't always report the news as such. And the other sad thing is that often science journalists with a science background are excluded from journalism because of what I want to say is gatekeeping, because other journalists that are more journalisty are like, oh, you're a scientist. Like, I'm a journalist. Like, this is my realm. Like, you have a conflict of interest because you know science. It's like, um, if you're a mechanic, you can work on cars because that's your training. You don't have a conflict of interest with it. So the science and journalism are not in conversation in the way they should be. And and it's sad because journalism, obviously the news goes out to everyone, and the way journalists report science is the way people think about science for the most part. Like when you turn on your nightly news and I forget all the different anchors' names, but I really like the CBS anchor because it's based in Washington and I used to live there, and she's always reporting different studies. First of all, it's rare to see science in the news unless it's like a cancer breakthrough. But even with cancer breakthroughs, I saw a paper. It was a study of brain cancer, and I saw the study first on my Twitter, and it had the study. It had three studies. In two of the studies, the cancer was transiently reversed. Transiently, not permanently, just temporarily. And then I saw the CNN coverage and it said, huge step forward in brain cancer studies, this cured cancer, which it did cure cancer technically, I guess, maybe, but only for transit, not permanently, temporarily. So um, when people do journalism like that, it gives false hope to people, it misinforms people, and then when they find out misleading people is a great way to lose trust with them, because you cannot over deliver, like you cannot overstate the findings, and then sometimes people find out the real findings and they might even feel betrayed. So there's why scientists need to be in a conversation more. And then the other thing about scientific journalism is what sells stories isn't scientific rigor. It's not realistic to expect every member of the public to take mainstream science reporting, also called pop science, with a grain of salt. As scientists and science communicators, we can make the interpretation of emerging research findings easier. Stories we share as scientists should be rigorously evaluated before sharing with the public and the media. Unfortunately, this approach doesn't sell stories. So then it goes back to, in my ideal world, we would all be critically engaging with and analyzing science, but we are not all critically engaging with science because not everyone likes science. Some people only read science when they have to go to the doctor and they read their like labs. Some people only watch science when they see a space launch. There are very few people. I met one person that actually reads science journalism for fun, but they are in the education field. So we can't expect everyone to love science as much as we do. So we have to make the work easier for people as scientists to understand science. And that involves learning communication skills. So the fourth reason should speak for itself by now after the pandemic. Misinformation occurs when people are ill-informed. Scientists are experts in science, so they should be part of the conversation when science is involved. And that includes, to some extent, dealing with people that say, no, you can't be part of the conversation because you're a scientist and XYZ reasons. It's just another form of gatekeeping because scientists should be able to contribute freely. And I think there's some communication skills that scientists need to learn so that they don't get seen as like having a conflict of interest, whatever that means. That's one of my main pet peeves about being a science journalist is constantly um, being told that I don't have the relevant knowledge or skills or insights or have a conflict of interest because that doesn't make sense. And it's a form of gatekeeping. So, science literacy is an important aspect of news literacy. And the more that we see this gatekeeping happen, the more we will see people be misinformed. Um, Journalism, not to fault journalists, because as we see, journalism is kind of in many ways a dying industry. Many papers are going under right now. So, um, it's kind of like a social problem. You know, like sometimes when there's a social problem and it's quite bad, it kind of breaks several sectors of society. And I think that the lack of science literacy has kind of like forced journalists to become the main purveyors of science to people. And that's not a job that journalists can do alone, especially with no science background. I mean, even if you don't have a science background, you can learn about science, but I don't think that most journalists are able to. If you have a scientist and they already have the science knowledge, then there doesn't make sense to keep them outside of the conversation because that just creates science illiteracy, and that is the worst thing that we could possibly have in the 21st century. Okay, so I wanted to talk also about the postmortem about COVID science journalism. Pardon my terrible pun. Postmortems are a pretty common way to describe like a after the fact analysis of something. Unfortunately, the COVID had so much morbidity and mortality that it's just a terrible phrase. But in lieu of other phrases that I can think of that would explain this succinctly, I think we really do need to have a postmortem on COVID science journalism, the successes, the failures. There were a lot of successes. There were a lot of failures. Basically, getting a vaccine became something that only Democrats do, according to the news. Because when I open the news, I live in a red state in Oklahoma with very lot of Republicans, and we're 50% vaccinated here in Oklahoma City. And then I opened the news and it said that like Trump supporters are not getting the vaccine. And then it's like, well, the facts aren't being reported properly. So there's like a whole media critique that I could do that we're not going to get into because um, I don't know how fair it is to blame journalists for this, but I think we definitely at least have to raise awareness of the flaws. I don't, journalists have a very hard job. They often work for very low pay, sometimes no pay with tight deadlines, and they work with merciless editors, and their job is to serve the public, but people, just like we have a sociology of science, there's also sociology of journalism, and people have their own viewpoints and agendas. And when scientists are silenced through gatekeeping, that makes it really hard for the actual science to make it to the page of the journalism publication. And so um, science reporting was highly politicized. It casted blame on people for being skeptical, which as scientists, we know it's good to be skeptical and seek truth, seek information, and it didn't always get the facts right. So that's what you get when you exclude scientists from journalism. And it's not something that's overt. Like no one's ever told me like you should not write this story because you're a scientist, but it's something that is very subtle and very real. And I've talked to other journalists about it, and no science journalist that I've talked to really likes this. But it's just a problem that if scientists were better communicators, we wouldn't need journalists. We could just communicate directly with journalists. We could communicate directly ourselves. So where do scientists fit into all of this? Now that I've basically done a very whiny criticism of journalism. So journalists can learn to communicate effectively to be better able to interface. Sorry, scientists can communicate effectively to be better able to interface with journalists and the communications world. They can become science journalists themselves or do science journalism alongside their research to help make their work more easily accessible and advance science news literacy, which is really important since scientists are experts in science. I'm going to say that again because it's true. Scientists are expert in science. journalists are not experts in science. So the conflict there is that simple, but it's not a conflict created by journalism. It's a conflict created by many factors, of which insufficient science communication training in graduate and undergraduate science programs is just one small part. The other problem is there's no established career path for scientists in communications heavy fields. Science writers, science journalists again, science policy professionals, we didn't even talk about policy, science communicators, people like Carl Sagan, Neil deGrasse Tyson, they became science communicators just, I mean, I don't know how either of them became science communicators, but they're definitely very famous, and there's a ton of science communicators out there. But it's not just communicating science to media outlets or just writing about science, it's also communicating science to policy professionals, which most policy professionals are not scientists. They're like political science majors, lawyers. They're people that probably never had to take a science class. And so I'm not sure with the gatekeeping in the policy world is a lot different because there's just so few scientists. Every time you see a scientist, like there's a literal scientist there, like helping them. But for the most part, it's just I've worked in Congress and I was the only person in my office with a master's in science. I mean, I didn't do a thorough overview of everyone's degrees, but I think we had like a lawyer, we had several people that were like career politicos, and then we had me who had a master's in science and was starting out as an intern in the US House at 30-ish, being the same age as the chief of staff, which is the highest ranking person in the office. But being the one of the lowest people on the ladder. So it was not something that I really wish on anyone because let's say you've done your bachelor's, you've done your master's, then you go to Congress and you're literally on the lowest rung. There's got to be a better way. So I also wanted to point out that despite the gatekeeping, there's actually some really great science journalists that are very well recognized. The best science writers are scientists. Ed Yong did his master's. He left research to become a writer. Dr. Catherine Wu, she's a PhD level scientist. I think she did her PhD at Harvard or MIT or something. And then she worked at the New York Times explaining COVID science. And then she worked at the Atlantic. They both were Ed Yong and Catherine Wu both work at the Atlantic right now, I think, or last I checked, which was like 2 years ago. They both won the Pulitzer Prize. Why did they win the Pulitzer Prize? Because their writing was good. It was informed by science and it helped people in the pandemic. So um, I don't want to make it seem like journalism is like this terrible place where they hate scientists. Obviously, individual journalists value science a lot, but there's also a lot of subtle ways that scientists are being excluded, sometimes on purpose, some occasionally on purpose due to gatekeeping, often not on purpose, just because they are trying to, if you're a scientist trying to navigate these places where you have to communicate well, have like I want to say mainstream people skills because we have like science people skills where it's like science talking to a scientist. Like that is very information based, but like regular people skills is not something that graduate students and undergraduates in science really take pride in. And it's probably because they don't get training in it. Maybe if they got like just a little bit of training in that, they could have more confidence. So that's all I had to say today.